Tonight we have a very familiar face around here. We all know her. She's been here 6.5 years. Can you believe that? 5.5. Okay, 5.5. Well, that's still a long time. Eleanor Osborn, a friend of all of us. So, and her daughter Joan. So Joan's going to start out, I think, and then Eleanor's going to read something a little bit later. Feel free to ask questions after this is over with, okay? Okay, thank you.
Good evening. As Joan said, my name is Joan Henkle, and I'm Eleanor's daughter, second daughter. She has another daughter, Victoria, who lives in New Jersey, so you don't see her as much. Also here is my husband, Richard Henkle. Where did he go? Over there. I got him. And my son, Jeffrey Henkle, which is Eleanor's grandson, and Trevor Henkle, her great-grandson, or Jeffrey's son. And Trevor is 6 years old now, which is about almost a little less than 90 years younger than my mother. So we have a 90-year span here with Trevor. Today we're going to talk about my mother's life story, some of the stories that we have about her. Some of it we're going to read, and then some of it I'm going to take out of a book that I have. But I wanted to ask this audience a couple of things. How many of you were either born or were raised or spent some time living on a farm in your childhood? Raise your hand. Many of you. So you already have something in common with my mother, who was born and raised on a farm in northern Indiana, in Goshen, Indiana. And then let me ask you one other thing. How many of you have kept a diary sometimes in your life? Many of you? Okay. Another very common thing with my mother, but especially my grandmother, Ruth Landis. And my grandmother, Ruth Landis, kept a diary for over 80 years, from 1909 to 1989. That's over 80 years. She wrote about her life, and of course, during that whole span, 70 of those years, my mother was in them, because my grandmother died 20 years ago, but up until then, she kept diaries all her life. So we had all these diaries, and we inherited, my mother, my sister, and I, and we said, what are we going to do with them? Now, what are you going to do with your diaries? Anybody know? Do you have any plans? In the dumpster. Well, your children, hopefully your children, your grandchildren will want to read them, but then what do you do with them? Well, that's what we thought too. What do we do with these diaries? So we all had them, and we said to my sister, Vicki, you do something with them. Vicki's the literary one in our family. She can write. And so actually she did something with them. She wrote a book. And this is called the Books of Ruth. And it's all about her grandmother, or Eleanor's mother, and her diaries. These are excerpts from the diaries in the form of a book. And actually it can be bought on Amazon.com, and I have some here for you afterwards. But it's the older I get, the nicer it is to look back at this. It's only been a couple of years since she wrote this. And we can find out a lot about what went on in my mother's life as well as my grandmother's life, not only in northern Indiana, but she says things about the Midwest and about Hoosiers and about Mennonites and about what went on in that time from 1909 to 1989. So I'm going to read you some excerpts or some passages for that in a minute. So one thing I want to do right now is to give this microphone to my mother, and she will start reading about where she was born.
This will make more ice.
I was born on a farm near Goshen, Indiana.
I'll hold it. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'll hold it for you.
When I was 5 months old, I moved out to a 60-acre farm near Benton, Indiana, where I lived through high school. I helped on the farm, collecting eggs, milking cows, planting vegetables, and picking cherries. Since my parents had 19 siblings between them, there was always a lot of company. When I was 6 years old, I was an early traffic victim when I was struck by an automobile. I was in a coma for a while, but I recovered. I also caught the flu in 1919, the one that killed thousands of people. My older sister Jeanette and I went to school in town, sometimes by Model T, by sleigh, bobsled, and even milk wagon. In 1927, we were given our own pony and buggy for transportation.
How many of you had the flu? Did you have anybody have the flu of 1919? That was the big one. And you know, we had a lot of talk a few years ago, the pandemic flu. And this one was bigger than that, killed millions of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. All of her family had the flu and they all survived. So I always liked that because I figure she had good immunity to a lot of viruses and passed it on to us. So hopefully we won't get the flu if the big one ever comes. Eleanor was very active in school activities. She was on the basketball team, in many plays, including she played Beth in Little Women. She earned awards as a flutist, some people say a flautist, and played the piccolo solo from Stars and Stripes Forever at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. So she played the flute solo in the Chicago World's Fair in 1933. All of her relatives were Mennonites, and she was also, and she attended the Mennonite church with her family. After high school, Eleanor moved to Fort Wayne to attend International Business College. In Fort Wayne, she met Dick Osborn on a double date. After college, Eleanor moved to California for 1.5 years and returned to Goshen to marry Dick at the 8th Street Mennonite Church on March 31st, 1940. The reception was on the farm. Their marriage lasted 59 years until her husband Dick died in 1999. She went out to California because Dick was out there, and then he decided he didn't want to stay in California, so he came back home. So after 1.5 years, she came back home. I guess both of them did not like California, didn't like the climate. They wanted to come back to the Midwest. Okay, right here.
After I was married, we moved to Gary, Indiana, where Dick co-owned a grocery store, but we soon moved to the Detroit area, where Dick took up accounting and I worked at Arthur Anderson accounting firm. Eventually, Dick formed his own public accounting firm and I did the company's payroll bookkeeping. I lived in 5 different towns in the Detroit area. Our first daughter was born in 1942, and then another daughter and 2 sons came along. When the children were young, many holidays were spent on the farm and the Osborn cottage on Lake Gage near Angola. But we also took the kids on sightseeing trips in the eastern and southern states. We also enjoyed the Chicago and New York nightlife and playing bridge with friends.
And I have to say, I was part of that nightlife at an early age in New York because my dad was an accountant or CPA. And he had to work very hard on April 15th tax time, right? So like March and April, he was busy. So that didn't deter my mother. She gathered me and my sister and my aunt up, and we got to go to New York and to go to the plays while he was home working hard. so we had a good time. That's when I have to admit, and Trevor will probably appreciate that, I loved to go up and down the elevators in New York when I was little. Dick and Eleanor took up golf and became active members of Oakland Hills Country Club in Bloomfield, Michigan. She even kept score for Lee Trevino in the U.S. Open. Many of you golfers or ex-golfers remember Lee Trevino? He was a pro golfer and she was his scorekeeper during the U.S. Open at Oakland Hills. They expanded their travels to Europe and the Far East. I have to say too that my father never wanted to travel until he got older, and Eleanor finally convinced him to go to England, to Europe. He had such a wonderful time, just that first time, and they went back many times. He just loved England. But then they also expanded their travels to Europe and the Far East. The growing Osborn clan began triennial reunions, first in Michigan and then later in Lake Tahoe, Bermuda, the Tetons, and a Caribbean cruise. And I'm sure my son Jeff remembers some of that because he started out younger than Trevor, going on these nice reunions every 3 years with the whole family, with all the cousins and everybody. Her hobbies, Eleanor's hobbies, included sewing and knitting, bowling, always bridge, and entertaining. Eleanor always made birthday parties, Halloween, and holidays very special. And she especially loved Halloween. She used to dress up like the kids in Halloween. And but the funny thing was she often dressed up, and my dad didn't know what she was dressing up as. And so she would sneak out the back door and come around the front door and go trick-or-treating, and then he'd open it up and give candy out, and he had no idea that it was his wife there. He thought it was some teenager in the neighborhood. Well, one time she thought she'd pull a trick on him, and so she dressed up as some sort of a hobo or somebody in disguise, and she came in, and my dad gave her a piece of candy, and then he turned around, and then she grabbed the whole thing and ran out the door with it. And he didn't know what to do, call the police or what. He was so startled. He thought some neighborhood hoodlum stole all the candy. She finally let him know. But she played tricks like that on the family for quite a, so both my brothers and my sister remember those Halloweens quite well. And this is the last part about moving to the summer trees.
I moved to Summer Trace in Carmel, Indiana, from Birmingham, Michigan in January 2006. I have 7 grandchildren and now have 10 great-grandchildren. I feel I have had a good life.
And I think you all probably feel that way too, especially when you get to live to be 95, almost 96. I want to go back a little bit. Again, this is a wonderful book that my sister wrote. It was a nice gift from her to the family, my mother. She spent a lot of time on this, much love, and so we really appreciate it. And the older we get, the more we appreciate it. Some of the things I'm going to say here, when we talked about the farm, she wrote in this book, the farm was over 100 years old when they lived there. We played croquet on the front lawn. We did a lot of croquet. I don't know if a lot of you remember croquet. Sure. It's a great game, and we played a lot when we went to visit on the farm. We picked cherries, gathered eggs and daffodils, climbed into the hayloft to see the kittens, and ran past the bullpen. We have fond memories of that. Now, on page 59, my mother had mentioned that she often went to school and whatever they could have a milk wagon or a horse and buggy, so they did get a horse and buggy, her sister and she had a horse and buggy, and I think they were not much older than Trevor when they used to ride this to school by themselves a few miles. And, well, her sister was a couple years older, but the horse was named Joe. And my sister writes, the buggy and the pony Joe belonged to the girls and they enjoyed riding it to school. However, Joe was not happy with the arrangement and would trot between 2 closely placed trees in an attempt to unburden his load. Mom says that once on an overpass about 3 miles from the farm, a train ran beneath them, and it blew its whistle. Joe was so spooked, he tried to run, and he did run all the way home and succeeded in breaking his harness. You remember Joe, huh? Lots of fun times with Joe. Wouldn't it be fun, Trevor, to go to school with a horse and buggy? It would. Okay, on page 76 here, it talks about, let's see, what part do we want here?
How did you make it be green?